So let's tackle our list of users next. Now, the first important question is where do we want to output it? And the second question that depends on the first one is where we then actually want to manage our list of users. So where do we want to output that list? We get the user data here in the add user component, and technically we could simply add more HTML code in that component to also render a list. Maybe here, unordered list below the form. We could then manage our list of users with use state in here in add user and output it down there. That is something we could do, and technically that would absolutely work. But by the way I'm saying this, you already hear that this is probably not how we're going to do it. The idea in React really is that you work with a bunch of components, that you have small, isolated pieces of HTML code and logic where every component really has its own task, its own responsibility, you could say. And therefore, you want to keep your components small and focused. You could certainly argue that a component that fetches user input and then outputs this as a list is focused enough, but I would argue that it's better to have one component that fetches user input. That's this add user component, which we already have. And then we have another component that is responsible for outputting the list of users, so that we split the outputting and the fetching logic into two different components. And therefore, I'll add a brand new component, the users list component, like this. And here, the users list component should be responsible for, well, outputting my user data. Therefore, in there, of course, we're going to write a React component. So let's import React from React so that we can use JSX code. And then here we have users list. We get our props here. And we, of course, export our component here so that we can use it in other files. And then here, I want to, in the end, return an unordered list where I want to go through a list of users, which I, well, need to get in some way, and output a couple of list items for every user. So one list item for every user. How should this work? Well, I think it makes sense to assume that in the users list component, we rely on props to get our actual array of users as data. So here between the unordered list, we could actually use props, let's say users. It's your component, so it's up to you which prop name you expect here. I expect to have a prop property which is named users, and that should hold an array of user data. So we can use the map method, which you learned about in the lists and conditionals module, to map that array of users to an array of JSX elements. So to transform our user data to JSX elements, which then are rendered onto the DOM. So map executes a function on every item in the user's array, and we'll get that item as an input. Since it's an array of users, I'll name that single item user and write an anonymous arrow function here. And then in this anonymous arrow function, we return a JSX element for every user of that user's array we expect to get on this prop. So the element, the JSX element which I want to render, is simply a list item here. And inside of that list item, I want to output the user name. Let's say we expect user to be an object with a name property. Then we could do it like this. And then thereafter, maybe in parentheses, and that's just text here, not a special React syntax. So between this parentheses text, I want to output, let's say, user.age years old. So my expectation here is that users is an array of user objects where every object has a name property and an age property. Why can I expect this? Because we're the ones creating this app. It's up to us to decide how we want to manage our data, and I want to manage an array of user objects where every object has a name property and an age property. So with that, we have the logic in place to output our users. Some styling would be nice, and for that, I first of all will wrap this list in a card. So I want to have that card component look here as well. So I'll import card again from UI card. And we need to import it here, even though we already imported it in add user, because you need to import what you want to use in a certain component into every component where you want to use it. So it's not enough to just import card once in another component. You need to import it in every component where you want to use the card. With that, we can use card here to wrap the unordered list. And now I also want to have some styling. And for that, you find a users list.module.css file attached, which you can just drag and drop into your users folder. And from there, you know the game, we can import classes from users list.module.css to use that CSS modules feature. And then here on the card, I'll add the class name prop, which I can because a few lectures ago, we made sure that we utilize our incoming class name prop here inside of the card. So we can set it here, we can set that prop, and I set it to classes.user to have not just the default card class on that card component, but also my special user class. Excuse me, users, not user. With that, we got a users list component. Now we need to use it. And that leads us to the next question. Where do we want to use this brand new component? We could use it here in add user. We could use it here below the form, users list like this. We just have to add an import, and we could use it there. That would be fine, but I don't think it makes sense. It's the add user component. If some other developer would have written this component and you would need to use it in your application, would you expect that this component does not just fetch the data and add it, but that it also outputs the user data? By the name add user, it doesn't sound to me like it's going to output anything. It's just about adding something, about getting some data to add something like that. So whilst you again could technically render it here, I think it logically makes more sense to include it somewhere else. And in case you're now wondering how you should decide where to render it, it's your app in the end. You can render things where you want. You can structure your app in the way you want. And the more you work with React, the more you will get a feeling for common patterns and practices. In this course, you will also learn a lot about that and of course see a lot of examples. Here, I want to render the users list in the app component, because that's also where I use add user. So to me, it makes sense that we then have users list here as a component next to add user. So we build our app here. We first have the block for getting that user data. Then we have the block for outputting the user. And below that, we might have other parts in the app, like a footer or something like that. Now to use that users list component here, we need to import users list from /components users list like this. And now we can use it, though it won't work. And actually, whilst we don't get an error here, we do see an error here. Cannot read property map of undefined. Now I told you not to panic when you see an error message, so let's see what's the problem here. It points us at the users list component, line 9, and it shows us the code snippet that's the problem. Here, it's in the end where we call map on the user's prop. This fails because map does not exist on undefined. What does this tell us? It tells us that in the users list component, here, users doesn't seem to be an array, it seems to be undefined. And undefined, of course, is a value type in JavaScript. And indeed, undefined, this value type doesn't have a map method. That is correct. You can't map undefined. Now, why is users undefined? Because in the place where we use users list, so in the app component, we're not setting that user's prop. Keep in mind, I'm extracting users from props. So I expect to get that user's data, that array in the end, on a user's prop on my users list component. So when I use this component in JSX, when I use it as a regular HTML tag in the end, I need to set that user's prop or I need to include a check here where I check whether it's undefined and I don't even try to map it. That would be an alternative. But here I of course always want to set it. So in app.js we need to set the users prop, and this has to be users because that's the name we are retrieving here. If you picked a different name here, you need to pick a different name here too. But I'm working with users, and we need to set this to an array. And for now, an empty array, of course, does the trick. With that, we don't see a list, but we also don't see an error, and we at least see the card where the list will eventually be rendered. That was a huge step forward. Now let's make sure we actually manage a list of users. We got a list of users which we feed to users list, but it's always an empty array, and that of course is pretty static and doesn't lead to any users being output. Now I want to make sure that when we click that add user button in the add user component, we don't just log that user data here, but instead we really create a new user object with that data, and we add that to an array of users object, which we then output in the users list. And how do we do that? Well, for that we need this concept which was called lifting the state up. We need to manage our list of users in a place where we can get both access to the add user component and, well, get notified when that add user button was clicked, as well as where we got access to the users list component to feed our users array into it. And we don't have access to users list inside of add user, for example. So managing our users list state here would be wrong, our users array. Users list component sounds like the right place because there we need that list, but there we don't get access to the added user data. That add user form is out of reach here. And actually we already configured this users list component to work differently and to get the users data from outside via props. Because that's the place where we want to manage our state. We want to manage it in the app.js component because that's the one component above both add user and users list. It's the nearest component above those two components which has access to both components. And therefore we lift the state management up to this app component. So we want to manage our users array here. And we do this with the use state hook, of course, because it's state of this app. And when that state data changes, the app should re-render. And that's exactly what use state and the state managed by it does. And therefore here we call use state instead of app, and we initialize this with an empty array. Now, as you learned, use state always returns two elements, so we can use array destructuring, and we got our, let's say, users list and a set users list function. And it's now the users list which I want to forward to the users list component. With that, it's still an empty array, but we have a function that allows us to change that array, and then that change would trigger that app component to be re-rendered, and hence the users list component would be updated as well, because it would also be re-rendered since it's part of the app component. So now the missing piece is that when we click the add user button, and hence the add user handler in the add user component runs, we forward the entered username and the entered age to the app component. And we do this with props as well. You learned this as well. We can add a prop here on add user, and we can name it however you want. For example, on add user. And I just use this on something convention because in the end it will kind of work like an event. Now we'll handle it fully ourselves, but in the end it is like an event. When that add user button is clicked, which ultimately happens upon a click on the button, surprise, surprise, then a function which we pass to on add user should be triggered. It's a function we have yet to define, and we can define it here, the add user handler here in the app component. And that's a function where I actually expect two arguments, the username and the user age. And you can name these parameters however you want, of course. I expect to get that data, and with that data, we can create a new user and add it to our list here. By calling set users list and then updating the state. Now here I want to update the state by taking the old list and appending a new element to it. And as you also learned earlier, when your state update relies on the previous state, you want to use an alternative form of setUsersList. You want to use that function form where you pass a function to setUsersList. And that function will automatically get the previous latest state snapshot when React performs that state update here. And therefore I'll name that privUsersList. The name is up to you. And you then should return your new state snapshot in the body of this function you passed to setUsersList. So here I'll return an array, a new array, where I first of all copy all elements from privUsersList. And that's the spread operator, which simply pulls all elements out of that array and adds them as new elements to this new array. And then I add one new element at the end. I add a new JavaScript object here, which should have a name field. Uname is the value we store there, and a age field, which stores UH as a value. So the two values we get as parameters here. And with that, we create a new JavaScript object for every user, and we add that to our users list array. And now we just need to wire this up. Add user handler is what I pass to the onAddUser prop here on my addUser component. And now inside of the addUser component, we need to utilize this onAddUser prop. So here in addUser, in the addUser handler there, so inside of the addUser component now, instead of console logging, I will call props.onAddUser. And I'll execute it as a function here because I know that what I get as a value on that prop will be a function. Because we're passing a pointer at addUserHandler to onAddUser, and addUserHandler is a function. So we can execute it as a function inside of the addUser component. And now we just have to forward our two pieces of data, the entered username and the entered age, which we got stored in this addUser component. And with that, we're forwarding that entered data to the app component upon every click on the addUser button here inside of the addUser component. And I know that's a lot of addUser and user, but that's what this app is about in the end. And I want to use names you would realistically also use in real apps. So with that, this function is triggered, and if we now save everything, we should be able to enter max and add a user. Now we're getting a warning here. We'll fix this in a second, but you can tell that this generally seems to work. Now what about this warning? You should know what's causing this, and you should know how to fix it. So here's a quick second for you to pause the video and fix it on your own, and then we'll fix it together. So, do you remember what's causing this? It's a warning thrown by React, and in the end it tells us that every child in a list should have a key prop which has a unique value. React needs this to efficiently update list items and re-render them efficiently. Now we got only one list which we render in this whole application, and that's inside of the users list here, this part. We create a bunch of list items here, and that's exactly the thing that should have a key prop, because it's the item you repeat. So here we should add a key prop, and that in turn should hold a unique value. So something like G1 here is not valid because that's hard-coded, and the same for every list item that's being created. Instead, I think it makes sense that in the place where we create a user, we don't just create a user with name and age, but we also give it an ID. We give it an ID, and that could be math random toString, some pseudo-unique ID. Now every user has an ID that is roughly unique, and inside of our list, we can now utilize this ID field so that the key is set dynamically to user.id. And that ID is now unique for every user. So if we now save this and we retry this, we no longer get any warnings here because now this works as it should. And with that, we're almost done. The missing piece is that modal. Now, it's something we haven't built before, but even though it might seem totally different because it's an overlay on the entire page, it's actually not too far away from what we built thus far. So definitely give it a try on your own first, and thereafter we will learn how we can build such a modal together. So we want such an error modal. Now, a modal is simply this overlay box, and for me that's a UI element we could be using in different parts of the app. This, of course, is a trivial app that has only one part, but we're always thinking from the perspective of potentially bigger apps. Therefore, I'll add it in the UI folder because such an error modal could be a reusable UI element. So I'll add my error modal.js file in there. And in that file, we of course import React from React. We got our error modal here, which got props, and we export this like that. Now that's the first step. Now the second step is of course to fill that with some life, and generally it's totally up to you how you want to structure your modal. I actually want to reuse that card, so I'll import card from card like this, and use this as a wrapper for the entire modal. Because I like that rounded corners look and so on, I want to use that therefore. Now inside of that card, my modal should have different sections. I want to have a header with the h2 tag where we actually can output some title. Now below that, I want to have a div which holds my main content, and in there a paragraph with the error message I want to display eventually. And below that, a footer. Now, in that footer, I want to have a button which we can click to close the modal. So for that, I'll import button from ./button to also reuse this component. And this shows this reusability of components. We're using the card in various places of the app. We're using the button in different places of the app. And we only defined these components and their styles once, and we can build our entire UI with these reusable building blocks. That's really the heart and the core idea, or one of the core ideas of React. So we got the button here, and hence in the footer, we can add such a button and say OK, or something like that on it, so that this is our close the modal button in the end. Now, between the h2 tags here, I want to have some title, and of course that modal should be configurable from outside. I don't want to hard code the title and the message into this component. It should also be reusable, so that we can use it in different places of the app to show different error messages. Hence here, I output something dynamic between curly braces and use, let's say, props.title. Again, it's your component. You can use any prop name you want here, but I expect to get a title prop which holds the text which should be output here. Now between the paragraphs, I want to output props.message, so that we also expect a message prop which, well, holds the message that should be output here. And I also want some styling. For that attached, you find the error modal.module.css file, and you can again just drag that into your UI folder next to the error modal.js file, and then import it here. Import classes from /error modal.module.css. Because I'm also using CSS modules here to have unique class names, and there are a couple of classes that should be attached. For example, here on the card itself, I want to add the classes.modal class, which is one of the classes defined here in the CSS file. In addition, on the header, I want to have the classes.header class, and on that div that surrounds the paragraph, I will add the classes.content class. On the footer, we'll also add a class, and that's the classes.actions class. And these are all CSS classes predefined in that CSS file. With that, we'll have a basic modal, and we can already see that in action. The question is, where do we want to render it? As part of which component? And you can actually argue about that. You can argue that it should be rendered inside of add user because ultimately it will be this component that will trigger the modal. You could also argue that it's a general overlay over the entire UI, and therefore logically it should be rendered as high as possible in the component tree. Something like inside of the app component or anything like that. Now, I will go for the place where it actually is being caused, and that would be the add user component, but you can definitely also pick a different place. You then, of course, will need to update your state management appropriately. I will write state management code that ensures that it works here inside of the add user component. So here I want to output my error modal, and therefore we have to import it, of course. So we go here and import error modal from UI error modal. Now we also need to configure it. We need to set a title, and we'll soon set this dynamically, but now I'll set it to an error occurred and a message, which we can set to something went wrong. But this will not work. And do you know why? I briefly touched on it in the debugging section. Well, if we try to save this, we'll get an error. We'll get the error that we got adjacent JSX elements and that this is not allowed, basically. Indeed, React doesn't allow two side-by-side components being rendered directly as a root element of your return statement, and you therefore need to wrap this, for example, in an extra div. We'll later see a different solution for this. For now, we'll just take an extra div and put our error modal and our card into that div, so that the div is returned by the return statement, and then inside of the div, we can have adjacent elements. And with that, it compiles, and if you reload, hey, this doesn't look too bad. We got our modal here. Now, of course, it's not dynamic. Of course, we can't close it right now. And of course, one crucial thing is missing, and that's a backdrop for the modal. So an overlay between this modal overlay and the actual main page, so that we can't interact with the rest of the main page, which currently is possible. So, to make sure we can't interact with the rest of the page, back in the error modal, I'll add an extra div next to the card, not inside of it, but next to it. And therefore, as you just learned, we need a general div that wraps both that extra div and the card. And on that extra div, I'll add a class, and that's the classes.backdrop class. The div itself is empty, but this backdrop CSS class makes sure that we have this grayish, black, transparentish background behind the modal. If we now save everything, you can see the background here, and now I can't interact with the form anymore, for example. So with that, we got the modal in place. Now, of course, the goal is to show it only sometimes, only if we do try to submit invalid data, and of course, we want to make sure that we can also dismiss it. So let's make sure we only show the error modal if we entered something invalid. So in the add user component, currently, if we have an empty input or an invalid age, we just return. We cancel this function execution. I want to continue doing that, but in addition, I also want to show an error message in the future. And therefore, we need a way of dynamically showing and hiding this error modal. Put in other words, we need to update our UI conditionally based on the question if we have an error or not. And what does this scream for? State management. We need to manage some error state. And that could be a string, like the error message. That could be an object which bundles error, title, and message, whatever you want. But we need to manage such an error state so that we can set it to we have an error, in which case we want to render the modal, and so that we can set it to we got no error, in which case we render nothing. I mean, we still render the form, but we wouldn't render the modal in that case. So we need an extra piece of state here, use state, and the initial value is actually undefined, so I don't need to pass any other initial value here between the parentheses. Now I'll name that error and set error, because in the end I'm going to manage some error information here. And now again, it's your app. It's up to you how an error should look like for you, if it's just a string or if it's an object. I will manage an error as an object here. So here, in that first validation part, I will call setError and set this to an object where I want to have a title, like invalid input, and a message where I say, please enter a valid name and age, non-empty values, something like this. And this will set the error state. Now I'll do the exact same here in the second validation function. I'll change the title to invalid age, because here we know that the age is the missing piece and that the age is invalid. And I'll have a different message as well. I'll have a message that says, please enter a valid age greater 0. So that's my error message here. So we set our error state in both cases, but we set it to a slightly different object in both scenarios. The object always has the same properties, and that is important so that we can reliably use it, but the properties hold different values. Now with that error state snapshot will hold that error whenever we call setError, because then the entire component will re-render and error will hold that latest error object as a state snapshot. Hence, we can use that down there in our JSX code to conditionally render the error modal. We just need to check if error is a thing, and if it is, with that AND operator, we output error modal. Otherwise, if error would be undefined, well, nothing would be rendered here for this line. And that is how we can conditionally render a JSX element. We need wrapping curly braces around this, because this generally is a JavaScript expression, just one which then also holds a JSX element again. So now the error modal will only be output if we have an error. And now, since the error also is a more complex object with a title and a message, we can utilize that title and message to output it as the actual title and message in our modal. So here I'll bind title to error.title and message, of course, unsurprisingly, to error.message. And with that, if we save this, we get nothing here, but if I submit an empty form, you see here's my modal. Right now we have no way of dismissing it. The button doesn't work yet, but we can of course reload the page for now, so that I also show you the invalid age case. If I enter this, you see I get the invalid age error. So that is working. That works exactly in the way it should. Now let's make sure we can also dismiss it by either clicking on the backdrop or by clicking on the OK button. Now for that, what we need to do, of course, is we need to clear our error state, this error state. Because if we have an error, if what's stored in this state snapshot is truthy, which a JavaScript object is, we'll render the error modal. So the only way of getting rid of that modal is to reset error to undefined or to null or to any other falsy value, so that this condition is no longer met. Now to achieve this, I'll add a new function here, my error handler, which gets no argument, where I simply call setError and set error to null, to set it from an object to null. Null is treated as a falsy value, so now this would no longer be rendered. Now the only question is, how do we trigger this error handler function? Well, I would say from inside the error modal. Because inside of the error modal, we get this button and we get the backdrop. And on both, we want to register clicks and, well, trigger that error handling function. So on the div here, which renders the backdrop, I'll add an onClick prop, which is available on every default HTML component React offers, and trigger the props on confirm function, let's say. Again, it's your component. You can name this prop whatever you want. You can name it onHandleError, or as I do it, onConfirm, whatever you want. The same for this button. I'll add onClick here, and we can add onClick here because our custom button component which we're using forwards whatever we pass to onClick to the native onClick prop. Hence, we can add it here. And here I also want to trigger props onConfirm. And when I say trigger, I of course mean that on the onConfirm prop, we also expect to get a function which we in the end just forward to the onClick prop, and somewhere down in that component tree, somewhere this will then be bound to the actual DOM element, and a click will trigger the function received on the onConfirm prop. So where do we get that function? Well, in the place where we use error modal. In the add user component, we use error modal. So here we now need to add this new onConfirm prop, which I just worked with inside of the error modal. And then here I want to pass in a pointer at the error handler function we defined, so that this is the function which is ultimately triggered when we click on the backdrop or when we click on the button. And with all of that, if we save this, we go back, I can now click here, get my modal, click somewhere on the backdrop, and it disappears. Click on the OK button, it disappears. Let's try a valid input, that works. Let's try an invalid input. We got the modal, we can dismiss it, and of course fix our mistake. And that all works, and that's the finished first app. Now the app itself is nice, but of course not overly complex, as I already mentioned. But we used all those core features and building blocks that are important for React. Components, props, state with the useState hook, lifting state up and all of these things. We used styling, we passed functions between the different components. So all these core patterns and concepts, which you basically need for every React application you're going to build, we have them all in here. And that's why this hopefully was a great practice and why we're now well prepared to continue.